My name is Elena Carter. I'm 30 years old, and last week I texted my family. Doctor says surgery's tomorrow. Can someone be with me? My sister replied, I've got dinner plans. Good luck. My mother added, Don't be dramatic. It's just surgery. My father said nothing at all. That night, lying under the buzz of hospital lights, I realized silence can cut deeper than any blade. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't planning to suffer quietly anymore. Before I go on, let me ask you something. Have you ever reached out to family desperate for support, only to be met with silence or worse, dismissal? If you have, then you already know the kind of ache that never really leaves. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And hit like and subscribe, because if you've ever been betrayed by the people who should have loved you most, this story will feel all too familiar. I grew up in a house where appearances mattered more than oxygen. The curtains were always pressed, the silver polished, the smiles rehearsed like lines in a play. But behind those perfect dinner parties, there was a simple rule that shaped my whole life. Vivian first, Elena second. Sometimes it felt more like Vivian only, Elena never. I remember being 8 years old, standing at the bottom of the stairs in a pale blue dress that scratched at my skin. Vivian, 2 years older, was already twirling in front of the mirror upstairs. Mom kept adjusting her bow, praising how she looked like a little pageant queen. I tugged at my hem, hoping for even a glance. What I got instead was a sharp whisper. Don't slouch, Elena. Try not to embarrass us tonight. That night at the charity dinner, people cooed over Vivian's manners. I spilled a drop of juice on my plate and felt Mom's nails dig into my arm under the tablecloth. I didn't know it back then, but those small cuts would matter later. They taught me that silence was safer than asking for more. Flash forward to high school, Vivian sailed into the honors program drama club president, the girl every teacher bragged about. I was the one who stayed late cleaning chalk dust off my shoes because no one thought to pick me up after practice. Dad once left me waiting outside the gym for 3 hours. When I finally got home frozen and hungry, he just shrugged. Lost track of time, he said. No apology. Just a silence that told me I wasn't worth remembering. Even holidays carried the same imbalance. Christmas morning, Vivian's pile of gifts towered like a department store window. Mine was a sweater 2 sizes too big and a polite smile from Mom. We didn't know what you'd like, she said, as if that explained everything. The living room glowed with laughter and wrapping paper, but my corner stayed dim, a pile of fabric I never asked for. By the time I reached college, I'd stopped expecting their attention. Vivian went to Yale on scholarships and charm. I chose a small state school, worked part-time, paid my own bills. Mom called twice that year, not to ask how I was, but to remind me to attend Vivian's award ceremonies. Dad sent a check once unsigned, like a tax deduction he had to file. I deposited it quietly, ashamed that I even needed it. The clearest memory, though the one that still claws at me, happened when I was 21. I'd been biking home from class when a car clipped my back wheel. I tumbled skin-shredded, ankle-twisted. My first instinct was to call home. Mom answered, but her voice was hushed, impatient. We're on our way to the gala, Elena. Is it serious? I looked down at the blood streaking my knee, the way my ankle ballooned. I think I need a doctor, she sighed. Can it wait until tomorrow? Tonight's important for your father. Then she hung up. I limped myself to urgent care, leaning on strangers for support. By the time I hobbled back to the apartment, Mom had already posted pictures from the gala. Smiling faces, champagne glasses, Vivian dazzling in a red dress. Not one word about me. That was the night I stopped calling for help. But what I didn't know was that life would put me back in that same position years later, alone, bleeding, begging silently for someone to care. Work became my escape, though escape is too generous a word for fluorescent lights and stacks of paperwork. At 24, I landed a job as an administrative assistant at a mid-sized law firm in downtown Philadelphia. The pay was average, the hours long, but at least the office had a rhythm. Phones ringing, printers, groaning heels clacking down the tile hallways, it all drowned out the silence I knew too well at home. Yet, even there, I carried the Carter family shadow. Whenever Vivian stopped by the firm, usually to charm one of the partners during a fundraising event, my colleagues would gasp. That's your sister. She's stunning. Their eyes would flick back to me, the plain one at the copier hair-tied back blouse, wrinkled from overtime. They never meant it cruelly, but the comparison landed like a bruise all the same. Vivian thrived on attention. Every family dinner turned into her stage. She'd talk about her promotions, her trips abroad, the men who sent her roses. Mom leaned forward, hands clasped, hanging on every word. Dad chuckled in approval, as if she were some golden investment paying dividends. When my turn came, I'd start with something small. We just launched a new filing system at the firm, but Mom would wave her hand. "That's nice, dear. Vivian, tell us about your Paris trip again." The food would taste like ash in my mouth. The clink of Vivian's fork against her wine glass was louder than anything I could say. One night stands out more than the rest. I was 26, exhausted from 12-hour days, when Dad insisted I join a Carter family photo shoot. The magazine wanted a feature on local families making a difference. I almost laughed at the irony, but I showed up in a gray dress makeup minimal. Vivian swept in late, a gown shimmering under the studio lights. The photographer barely looked at me. "Let's get the star in the middle," he said, gesturing to Vivian. Mom beamed, Dad straightened his tie, and I slid into the far edge of the frame like a shadow. When the magazine came out weeks later, my name wasn't even mentioned. The caption read, "Patricia and Edward Carter, with daughter Vivian, the rising face of the city's young professionals." I stared at the page until my vision blurred. I could have torn it up, burned it, but instead, I folded it neatly and tucked it into a drawer. Proof, I told myself. Not of their success, but of my invisibility. I didn't know it back then, but keeping those receipts, every slight, every omission, would matter one day. By my late 20s, health problems crept in. At first it was fatigue. I brushed it off as overwork. Then the stomach pain started sharp enough to double me over. I went through rounds of tests, endless appointments. When the doctor finally said the word surgery, my mind went blank. I sat in the sterile room, the smell of disinfectant burning my nose, nodding numbly as he explained risks and recovery. I thought about calling Mom, but I could already hear her voice. "Don't be dramatic, Elena. People go through worse." I thought about Vivian, too busy flashing smiles at dinners. And Dad, well, silence had always been his only language. Still, I sent the message. Out of habit, out of some fragile hope. Maybe this time they'd show up. Maybe blood would mean something. But the response came swift and sharp. "Vivian, I've got dinner plans. Good luck. Mom. Don't be dramatic. It's just surgery. Dad, nothing." That silence wasn't new. It was confirmation. Decades of neglect compressed into a few glowing lines on a phone screen. And as I lay in the hospital bed that night, the beeping monitor steady the city lights cold beyond the window, I realized silence isn't empty. It's evidence. The night before my surgery, the hospital room felt more like a waiting room for judgment than for healing. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, harsh and cold, bleaching every shadow into something sterile. Machines beeped in steady rhythm beside me, indifferent companions in a space that should have been filled with family voices. Instead, there was only the echo of a message thread, Vivian's sharp dismissal, Mom's cutting remark, Dad's silence heavier than both combined. I stared at the screen until the letters seemed to burn themselves into my eyelids. It wasn't just rejection. It was a pattern carved deep over years resurfacing at the one moment I truly needed them. That night, I thought back to another winter years ago. I was 15 sick with the flu, my body shaking under sweat-drenched sheets. Vivian had a recital that evening, some charity event she was singing at. I begged Mom not to leave me alone, but she pressed a damp cloth to my forehead and said, "Don't be selfish, Elena. Vivian's future is important." Then, the door clicked shut, and I spent the night listening to my own ragged breaths while the house settled into silence. Hours later, I woke to applause through the phone Vivian's performance streamed live. I coughed until my ribs hurt, whispering to myself that one day I'd stop asking. I never did. Until now. The next morning, a nurse named Marisol adjusted my blanket with a kindness so simple it startled me. She smiled softly. "You're not alone, you know. We're here." Her words landed heavier than she intended because they carried a truth my family had denied me my entire life. Strangers offered more comfort than blood. That irony burned. I signed the consent forms with a shaky hand, the pen scratching across the paper louder than any heartbeat. Somewhere in the city, Mom and Vivian were probably sipping champagne, laughing in candlelight. Dad might have been reading the paper in his den, pretending nothing was happening. The contrast was brutal, and yet it clarified something I had never dared to accept. Their absence was not an accident. It was a choice. And choices leave trails. I remembered the magazine clipping in my drawer, the blurred edges of family photos where my face barely showed. I remembered the unanswered calls the nights I waited at school, the whispered, "Don't embarrass us before galas." Piece by piece, a mosaic of neglect. I had spent years burying it, ashamed to acknowledge it. But in that hospital bed, surrounded by humming machines and sterile air, I finally understood. The silence they wrapped me in wasn't protection. It was erasure. And I wasn't going to let them erase me anymore. That's why when the idea came quiet, dangerous, steady, I didn't flinch. I asked the nurse for a media contact form. My voice didn't shake as I requested a patient advocacy file. I didn't scream, didn't rage. I simply let the truth slip into hands that would actually hold it. Because if my family insisted on silence, then the world would hear instead. I didn't know how far it would go. I didn't know how quickly receipts could spread, how hungry the public was for the kind of story that sliced past dinner parties and gala gowns. But I did know one thing: once silence breaks, it can never be put back together again. And that was the night stillness gave me clarity, the night I realized my family had written their own ending long ago. All I had to do was let the world read it. The first broadcast hit harder than anesthesia. A local station ran my story in a 3-minute segment. My name, my face, the text messages anonymized but still visible enough to sting. "We have dinner plans." "Don't be dramatic." The anchor's voice was calm, professional, but each word landed like a gavel. By the time the piece ended, the silence in my hospital room had been replaced by the ping of notifications. Within hours, flowers appeared at my bedside. Notes from strangers. Cards that read, "You're not alone." A support group offered to sit with me during surgery. Nurses teased gently, "You've got more people in the lobby than most politicians." And my family, not a word, not a text. The group chat stayed frozen 3 dots that never appeared. But when the second broadcast aired, Mom's voice finally surfaced. Not to me, but to a reporter outside a restaurant. She clutched her pearls, forcing a tight smile. "This is being twisted. Of course we love our daughter. People are making too much of a simple misunderstanding." The cameras didn't cut away when Vivian shoved past, microphones snapping. She's always been sensitive. Blowing things out of proportion is kind of her thing. Her brittle smile cracked on air, the whole city watching. I lay in bed, I-4 dripping steady, and felt something shift inside me. Their denial wasn't just hollow, it was ammunition. 2 days later, the group chat finally lit up. "Mom, Elena, please delete those posts. People are asking questions." Vivian chimed in. "You're embarrassing us. Nobody needs to know private things." Private. That word made me laugh, bitter and sharp. Was neglect smaller if hidden? Was loneliness less lethal when buried? I typed nothing. Just set the phone face down on the nightstand. An hour later, Dad appeared in the doorway of my hospital room, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. He didn't come to hug me, didn't ask how I felt. He just leaned against the frame eyes, avoiding mine. "Elena," he muttered this, "attention. It's not good for the family. You should end it." I stared at him, IV tugging at my arm, throat dry. "You mean end telling the truth?" His jaw tightened. "Sometimes the truth does more harm than good." I laughed, hoarse and raw. "To who, to me, or to the reputation you worship?" He had no answer. Just silence. Then he left, shoes echoing down the corridor like a gavel closing a case. The wound he left wasn't new, it was confirmation. My pain would always be less important than their image. By the end of the week, Vivian was cornered outside a charity brunch. Cameras swarmed, mics shoved in her face. "Why weren't you there for your sister's surgery?" someone asked. Her smile snapped. "We didn't know it was serious," she barked. She exaggerates, always has. The clip went viral before lunch. Comment sections exploded. How could she say that on camera? Imagine dismissing your sister like that. That afternoon, a nurse slipped me her phone. You should see this. On screen, Vivian's face froze mid-sneer, the words she exaggerates stamped across captions. For once, I didn't feel invisible. My absence was loud, undeniable. And her words, the same ones that had cut me down for years, were finally cutting her instead. Still, the ache lingered. Not triumph. Not yet. Just the familiar sting of knowing she'd rather defend herself to strangers than admit she failed me. 2 nights later, Dad returned. Same coat, same silence. He sat this time, pulling the chair close, but not too close. "You don't understand," he said finally, voice low. "Your mother spent years building this family's reputation. Vivian's career depends on it. What you're doing, you're tearing it down." I turned, staring at him until he squirmed. "I'm tearing it down? Or am I just showing the cracks you've painted over?" He flinched. For the first time, I saw something crack across his face. Not guilt, not love, but fear. Fear of being seen without the mask. "I'm asking you as your father," he whispered. Stop this. I wanted to cry, to beg him to finally be a father who chose me. Instead, I leaned back against the pillow's, voice flat. "You're not asking for me. You're asking for her, for them. And I've stopped saying yes." His eyes darkened. He stood leaving without another word. That night, I stared at the city lights through the blinds and realized I had just buried the last chance for reconciliation. And strangely, I didn't feel regret. I felt clarity. By the weekend, the crowd outside the hospital doubled. Volunteers held candles, handmade signs that read, "No one should face surgery alone." Reporters camped at the curb. Inside, Marisol tucked another bouquet onto the window ledge. "You're kind of famous now," she teased. But fame wasn't the word. This was presence. The kind my family never gave, arriving from strangers who owed me nothing. And yet the group chat stayed frozen. No apology, no visit. Just Patricia's pearl-clutched interviews. Vivian's brittle denials, Dad's shadowed silence. The contrast was suffocating. So much love outside, so much void inside. That wound cut deepest of all, realizing the whole world could see me except the people I once begged to. The city winter gala shimmered like a cathedral built for wealth. Chandeliers spilled gold light across polished marble floors. Strings swelled from the orchestra pit notes, floating like perfume over the sea of sequined gowns and pressed tuxedos. Glasses clinked, cameras flashed. For years, this night had been my family's crown jewel. I had attended before, always as a shadow trailing behind Vivian's radiance, Mom's practiced laugh, Dad's stiff handshake. But this year, the program bore a different name at the center. Mine. Keynote speaker, Elena Carter. I stood backstage, the navy dress clinging soft against my ribs, a microphone clipped at my collar. My hands trembled not from fear, but from gravity. I could hear the hum of the crowd, the scrape of chairs, the low murmur of anticipation. Then the host's voice rang out. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome tonight's keynote speaker, Elena Carter." Applause swelled polite at first, then rolling into thunder. I stepped into the light. The hall stretched wide, faces gleaming under chandeliers. Near the front, I saw them, Mom's pearls catching light, Vivian's smile frozen too wide, Dad leaning back in his chair, jaw tight. I didn't linger. I walked to the podium, steady steps echoing. My notes waited on the wood, but I barely glanced. I already knew what needed to be said. 3 months ago, I began voice clear. I asked a simple question in a family group chat. I held up my phone screen, glowing faintly. "Doctor says surgery's tomorrow. Can someone be with me?" The room stilled. Forks paused mid-air. The orchestra had gone silent. The answers came fast. "We have dinner plans." "Don't be dramatic." And silence. That was it. Gasps rippled across the hall. Some heads turned toward my family's table. Patricia's painted smile faltered. Vivian's nails dug into her clutch. I let the silence breathe. It pressed against the walls, heavy and sharp. But here's what I learned, I continued. Family isn't always the people who share your blood. Sometimes family is the strangers who show up when it matters most. The nurse who adjusts your blanket. The volunteer who holds a candle outside your hospital window. The neighbor who whispers, "You're not alone!" Applause broke scattered, then grew filling the hall. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled. I raised my hand gently and the noise hushed again. I didn't come here tonight to shame anyone. I came to remind us all that presence is the greatest gift we can give each other. And when blood turns away, we have the power to choose better. I paused, letting my gaze sweep the crowd. My eyes brushed my mother's bowed head, my sister's trembling jaw, my father's clenched fists. Then I turned away, back to the sea of faces rising to their feet. The applause thundered, rolling through the chandeliers, rattling glasses, lifting me higher than I'd ever stood. I didn't smile wide. I didn't gloat. I let a small cold smile flicker at the corner of my lips, a smile that said everything words never could. In that moment under chandeliers and camera flashes, I realized revenge didn't need shouting. It didn't need fists or fire. It only needed truth. And truth, once spoken, shines brighter than any spotlight. And as the applause roared on, my family sat silent in the dark, forced to watch. The gala ended hours later, but the echo of applause still clung to my skin like static. I slipped out a side door, the night air sharp and biting snow flurries catching in my hair. My heels clicked against the frozen pavement, each step lighter than the last. Behind me, the hall still buzzed with chatter reporters, scrambling donors, clinking glasses. And at the front table I had left them, Patricia, Vivian, Edward, frozen under chandeliers, their masks cracked beyond repair. But I didn't need to see their faces again. The damage wasn't in the moment, it was in the ripple. Tomorrow, headlines would run. Photos would circulate. Their neighbors would whisper louder than ever, and they would realize the truth they'd tried to bury had become the city's loudest conversation. I didn't need to confront them. I didn't need to scream. Silence was doing the work for me. Later that night, I sat in a diner booth under flickering neon, a chipped coffee mug warming my palms. The world outside was dusted in snow, the parking lot empty except for a few cars. It felt almost cinematic, like the city had paused to give me space to breathe. Then a voice broke the quiet. "Elena." I looked up. Daniel stood there, an old friend I hadn't seen in years, his coat-dusted white eyes searching mine. "I saw you on TV," he said, sliding into the booth. "You're stronger than you think." For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a ghost. I didn't tell him everything. Not yet. But as he spoke, as the neon light buzzed overhead, I realized something my family had spent years erasing me, but in trying to silence me, they'd given me the loudest weapon of all proof. They thought this was the end. But really, it was just the beginning. Because while they scrambled to salvage their image, I had only one plan: to let the truth keep breathing louder and wider until there was no corner left for them to hide. I wrapped my hands tighter around the mug, the steam fogging the glass. Daniel smiled softly, waiting. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. They thought I'd stay invisible, I whispered finally, more to myself than to him. But they've handed me the one weapon I needed. And the night outside seemed to lean in as if hungry for what would come next. If you've ever sat in a room full of people and still felt invisible, you already know part of my story. What happened to me isn't just mine. It belongs to anyone who's been dismissed, silenced, or told they were too dramatic for needing love. Don't let their voices define you. Let the truth speak louder. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know. And make sure you subscribe because, trust me, this isn't the last chapter.